May 1943. The dust of Tunisia still clung to our uniforms as we stumbled into the makeshift pens the Americans had built along the coast. We were the Afrika Korps, or what remained of it after the final collapse. For months, our rations had dwindled to crusts of dark bread, a few spoonfuls of watery soup, sometimes a strip of dried meat that was more sinew than nourishment. Men had grown thin, their cheeks hollow, their eyes sunk deep into sockets carved by hunger and exhaustion. In the final days, we had gnawed on roots, traded buttons for cigarettes, fought over the last drops of rancid coffee substitute. To surrender was shame enough. To face the enemy while starving, lice crawling in our collars, was humiliation beyond words. When the order came to lay down arms, many expected a bullet in the back or a slow death by thirst. And Sunday, we had been told endlessly that capture by Americans meant cruelty, starvation, perhaps worse. As we were marched to the port of Oran under armed guard, the sun beating mercilessly, I thought only of water and wondered if this was how a soldier of the Reich was meant to end, filthy and forgotten. At the barbed wire enclosure, we were lined up, our names taken, photographs snapped with cameras that seemed to work faster than any German device. Medics with stethoscopes checked our chests in minutes, inoculations given with such efficiency that entire rows were processed before I had even finished wondering what awaited us. We whispered that this was all for show, that the real suffering would come once the guards tired of playing civilized. My stomach burned with hunger, a gnawing emptiness that had become my only constant companion. Then the Americans brought food. Not propaganda leaflets, not insults, but trays of white bread so soft it seemed unreal, thick slices of meat steaming with fat, and coffee so strong its aroma cut through the stench of sweat and dust. For a moment, none of us moved. The sight alone was unbearable. In Germany, we had not seen bread this color in years. Our rations in Africa had been black loaves stretched with sawdust and rye, sour and hard. Here, before men we had tried to kill, lay food fit for kings. I remember taking the first bite. The bread yielded like a pillow beneath my teeth. The meat flooded my mouth with juices. The coffee scalded but revived me with a warmth I had forgotten. Around me, grown men ate like starved animals, some with tears streaking through the grime on their faces. Others stared in disbelief, waiting for the trick, certain there must be poison hidden in the flavor. A sergeant whispered that no army could waste such food on prisoners, but waste it they did, piling plates higher than we could finish. In that moment, as the sun set over the harbor and the smell of roasted beef carried across the pens, the truth pressed down heavier than any rifle butt. We had lost not just the battle in Africa, but something far greater. For the first time I understood that America's strength was not only in tanks and guns. It was in this abundance, this staggering ability to feed even its enemies better than we had fed our own. That night, lying on the ground with my stomach full for the first time in months, I realized with dread that the war had already been decided long before our surrender. It had been decided in the fields, the factories, and the kitchens of America. The morning after surrender, the contrast between what we had known and what we now experienced grew sharper with every detail. For months, in North Africa, our lives had revolved around scarcity. Each man carried a tin ration box that seemed emptier with every passing week. A crust of black bread, gray with fillers and rough to the tongue, was often our main meal. The so-called coffee was little more than roasted barley or acorns ground into bitter dust, mixed with water when we could find it. Meat was a rumor, and when it did appear, it came in stringy strips that reeked of age, shared between squads like treasure. Hunger had reshaped us, whittled muscle into bone, and gnawed at our tempers until arguments over crumbs were as common as artillery fire. Now in American custody, the scene was one of disorienting abundance. Prisoners who could barely stand were handed thick slices of soft white bread, loaves without mold, loaves that seemed almost luxurious in their purity. The taste alone was a revelation. Beside the bread came steaming stew filled with chunks of beef that glistened with fat, more meat in one meal than we had seen in months of desert campaigning. Real coffee followed, strong and dark, carrying a richness that none of us could mistake for imitation. We stared at the mugs as if they were relics from another world. I remember Hans, a corporal from Bremen, whispering that this had to be theater, some cruel trick to win our trust before the real punishment began. Others muttered that perhaps the food was laced with something, that no enemy would squander such supplies on men who had tried to kill them. Suspicion clung to every bite, yet hunger overpowered doubt. Plates were emptied, mugs drained, and still the Americans moved with mechanical efficiency, refilling as though supplies were limitless. The contrast to our own army was unbearable. In Germany, civilians queued for hours for thin rations, their children growing gaunt under blockade. Our families wrote of shortages so severe that holidays passed without butter or sugar. At the front, we learned to ration crumbs, to cut mold from bread, and eat what remained. And yet here, in captivity, the enemy provided meals richer than those we had seen even before the war. The disbelief ran deep. I saw officers who had clung stubbornly to pride lower their eyes in silence, unable to reconcile the propaganda of a starving, decadent America with the reality of overflowing pots and trays. Some prisoners pushed food away at first, muttering that it was indecent to eat so well while Germany suffered. But hunger always triumphed. Within days, even the most defiant were eating with abandon, their earlier contempt washed away by the taste of meat and the warmth of coffee. The effect was more than physical. It gnawed at the very foundation of what we had been taught. We had believed our struggle was noble endurance, that hardship was proof of strength, that sacrifice would deliver victory. Yet in the hands of our enemy, food itself became a weapon. Each full plate, each slice of white bread, carried a message louder than bombs. America could afford to feed its captives better than Germany could feed its soldiers. In those first days of captivity, the psychological blow was heavier than chains. We were not merely defeated in battle. We were confronted with proof that our entire vision of the war was built on lies. To look down at a tray of food and realize it surpassed the rations of the Wehrmacht was to feel the collapse of certainty. Many of us ate in silence, eyes lowered, for fear that speaking aloud would confirm what we all now understood. The war was not going to be won by hunger and slogans. It was going to be won by the nation that could turn its factories and farms into endless rivers of sustenance. And sitting there, chewing bread softer than anything we had known in years, we understood that we were no longer warriors. We were witnesses to a power that fought with production itself, a power too vast to resist. We began to understand that what filled our bowls was not simply charity, nor some passing whim of generosity. It was the machinery of a system so vast and methodical that every detail seemed calculated. The bread that arrived by the crate was not handmade by village bakers, but the product of automated mills and bakeries that operated day and night. The meat, cut in even portions, came from a supply chain that spanned thousands of miles, driven by refrigerated trucks and enormous slaughterhouses whose scale none of us could imagine. Even the coffee, steaming in tin mugs, traveled across oceans in convoys, guarded by fleets of ships built faster than we could sink them. In our army, food was improvisation. A field kitchen dragged by horses, a few battered pots suspended over open fires, half a dozen cooks struggling with scarce ingredients. When supplies failed to arrive, which happened often, we foraged or went without. In the desert, we had learned to boil shoe leather, to share a single tin of sardines among 10 men, to pretend that barley water was coffee. Logistics was chaos patched together with willpower. The Americans treated food as they treated ammunition, standardized, planned, and delivered with mechanical regularity. Their field rations were marvels of packaging, canned meats that lasted years, powdered eggs reconstituted into full breakfasts, chocolate bars fortified with vitamins. It was not luxury but calculation, a science of nourishment. Every calorie counted, every soldier guaranteed enough fuel to fight another day. We heard that their quartermaster corps had laboratories of dietitians and engineers designing meals for strength and endurance. To us, it seemed absurd, yet we tasted the results every day. What astonished us most was not only the abundance, but the indifference with which it was handled. In captivity, we saw guards throw away half-eaten bread, soldiers tossing apple cores and scraps into bins without a thought. Waste on a scale we could not fathom. A single garbage heap in an American camp contained more discarded food than our unit had received in a week at the front. It was not done to mock us. It was routine, a byproduct of surplus so immense it defied comprehension. I remember one of our officers, once a logistics clerk in Hamburg, staring at the camp kitchens. He whispered that the dishwashers alone, huge machines scrubbing trays by the hundred, consumed more power in an hour than his entire district had in a day under blackout restrictions. He was not exaggerating. In Germany, electricity was rationed, factories starved for fuel, trains delayed for lack of coal. In America, even prisoners ate meals prepared by machines running on electricity that seemed infinite. The lesson was brutal and inescapable. Our weapons had failed in Africa, our tactics broken by superior numbers. But what crushed us most completely was this invisible force of supply. We realized that behind every American soldier stood not just a rifle or a tank, but an entire empire of factories, farms, and kitchens. It was a weapon more relentless than artillery. You could not outflank it, could not bomb it into silence. It flowed on ships, roared in trains, steamed in kitchens, feeding armies and captives alike. At night, lying in bunks with stomachs full for the first time in months, we wrestled with the paradox. We had been trained to believe that hardship was proof of strength, that hunger built character, that endurance would conquer indulgence. Yet here, indulgence was discipline. Here, comfort was not weakness but system. And in that realization, the pride we once carried began to erode. The enemy had revealed that their true strategy was not only to fight us with bullets, but to drown us in evidence of their abundance. For me, the revelation came with a tin of Spam, the pink block of meat that the guards served without ceremony. I had never tasted anything like it, salty, rich, absurdly plentiful. They told us millions of tins had been shipped overseas, that American soldiers carried it everywhere. To us, it was more than a meal. It was proof. Proof that we were outnumbered not just by men and tanks, but by calories, by cans, by the endless assembly lines of a society that fought wars with conveyor belts as well as rifles. The thought settled deep into our minds, heavier than defeat itself. We were prisoners of an industrial giant, and every bite we took was a reminder of the war we could never hope to win. The scale of it revealed itself piece by piece until numbers became more terrifying than gunfire. Rumors spread through the camp that each American soldier received over 4,000 calories a day, not as a privilege, but as a standard calculation by their quartermaster corps. By comparison, even before capture, our rations in North Africa had fallen to less than 1,500 calories, sometimes as low as 1,200 inches the final weeks. The arithmetic of defeat was laid bare not in casualty lists but in calorie counts. 1 American stomach equaled 3 German. We began to hear figures that sounded like fantasy. In 1944, the United States produced 23 billion pounds of meat, enough to give every man, woman, and child in America nearly 2 pounds every single week. In the same year, Germany struggled to distribute a meager 200 grams per soldier per week. On American farms, wheat yields reached 60 bushels per acre, double the best German harvests, and they harvested millions of acres stretching beyond sight. We had fought for months over desert supply lines where every sack of flour was a treasure. Yet in America, silos overflowed, grain poured into rivers of abundance, and elevators groaned with more wheat than all of occupied Europe could consume. Even the factories of food seemed to dwarf our imagination. Prisoners who had worked at Campbell's or Swift facilities described production lines where electric belts and steam machines processed thousands of cans in a single day. A single American cannery handled more tomatoes in 24 hours than a German plant processed in a month. At a soup factory, one old woman pressed buttons that controlled machinery doing the labor of 50 men, all while sipping coffee and listening to a radio. It was automation that mocked the sweat and hunger of our own workers back home. We saw the statistics in every discarded scrap. At the docks, American sailors threw away whole loaves of bread, steaks half-eaten, gallons of milk soured by the Sunday. A corporal in our company calculated grimly that the waste from one Liberty ship's mess equaled his unit's weekly ration in Africa. And these were the same ships we learned were being built at a rate of 3 per day, 2,710 inches total, each assembled from 250,000 parts drawn from 32 states. The food on board was as abundant as the steel of their hulls. The camps themselves became living charts of production. Wooden barracks erected in 90 days, equipped with electric lights, hot water, flush toilets, and steam heating luxuries unknown even to many German civilians. Hospitals with X-ray machines and endless supplies of drugs, including penicillin, a miracle we had only heard whispered about in Germany. They used it freely, even on prisoners with trivial infections, while in the Reich men died for lack of basic sulfa powder. The more we learned, the more crushing the realization became. Numbers alone could conquer us. America had 135 million citizens, nearly twice our population. Yet it was not the count of people that mattered, but the engines of production behind them. One plant at Willow Run produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. At Rubbertown, 4 synthetic rubber plants produced 800,000 tons annually, while Germany, though inventor of the process, could not exceed 120,000 inches its best year. The Alcoa plant consumed 175,000 kilowatts of electricity, more than the entire city of Munich. To see such figures written down was unbearable. To witness them in motion was soul-destroying. We prisoners began to whisper among ourselves that the war had already been mathematically impossible. We had sent divisions across continents, but America sent calories, kilowatts, and conveyor belts. We endured shortages as proof of our strength. They turned abundance into proof of theirs. And in every bite of white bread, every mug of coffee, every scrap tossed casually into the garbage, we tasted the statistics that no propaganda could erase. The realization settled heavily in our minds. Defeat was not only on the battlefield. It was in the factories of Chicago, in the wheat fields of Kansas, in the canneries of New Jersey, in the refrigerators humming inside barracks built for captives. Against such numbers, our courage was irrelevant. We were being buried not by bombs but by tonnage, by yield, by output, by the cold, relentless arithmetic of American industry. It was in those long weeks of captivity that the real wound opened, not on our bodies but in our pride. At first, many of us clung to suspicion, convinced that the rich meals and clean quarters were a temporary illusion, a trap to break our spirit. Yet day after day, the routine remained the same. Bread that was soft and plentiful. Meat served without ration cards or excuses. Coffee poured until the pot was empty, only to be replaced with another. There was no trick, only repetition, and that was worse than cruelty. The humiliation lay not only in being prisoners, but in the knowledge that we were healthier in defeat than in service to the Reich. My own cough, which had plagued me for months in Africa, faded after steady meals and regular showers. Wounds healed faster. The hollow look of hunger softened in men's faces. We began to regain weight, to sleep more deeply. We were, without question, stronger captives than we had been as soldiers. And that realization gnawed at us more than hunger ever had. In the dim barracks, conversations turned bitter. "If this is what they give prisoners," one sergeant muttered, "what must their soldiers be eating at the front?" Another replied with a hollow laugh, "Steak every night, perhaps. Beer with every meal." The words stung because they felt true. We had marched across deserts on empty stomachs, convinced our suffering was a badge of honor, proof of German toughness. Now that honor felt hollow when set beside an enemy who could afford to make comfort part of discipline. The collapse of certainty was visible in the smallest gestures. I saw officers who once barked about sacrifice quietly savoring every bite of white bread. Men who had sworn oaths to fight to the death now lingered over cups of coffee as though it were the truest treasure of the war. Even the most fanatical avoided eye contact when trays piled with food arrived, unwilling to admit aloud what their stomachs already confessed. We had been lied to, and we had believed the lie because it was all we had. Shame crept into letters written home, censored though they were. Some tried to disguise the truth, describing life as tolerable. Others could not resist slipping in hints. We are being treated fairly, or we have enough to eat. Enough to eat words that in Germany had become almost a memory. We knew those lines would cut the hearts of our families, yet to remain silent was impossible. The contrast screamed too loudly to be hidden. The psychological blow deepened when news arrived of continued ration cuts back home. While we prisoners in America threw away crusts, our wives queued for hours to receive turnips and ersatz margarine. While we sat in warm halls with steaming mugs, our children endured blackout nights with stomachs aching. The inversion was unbearable. To be cared for by the enemy more than by our own state was not kindness. It was the most devastating insult of all. I remember staring at a slice of roast beef, steam rising in the air, and feeling not joy, but despair. That meat was not merely nourishment, it was a sentence. It said that our army, our nation, could not even provide what our enemy offered without hesitation. It whispered that everything we had believed about endurance, about superiority, was a hollow shell, cracked open by the simple fact of abundance. The war had taught us to fear shells, bombs, and tanks. Yet here in captivity, the deadliest weapon was a loaf of bread and a pot of coffee. They revealed the truth more effectively than any speech or propaganda. The truth that our cause was broken, that our pride was misplaced, that against the machinery of America's plenty, courage, and sacrifice were nothing but ashes. And as we lay in our bunks at night, full stomachs pressing against blankets that smelled faintly of detergent, the bitter taste of that realization lingered longer than any hunger ever had. When the war began, we had been told that battles would be decided by courage, by steel, by the will of nations. We believed that tanks, planes, and rifles would tip the balance, that discipline and sacrifice could overcome any enemy. But as the months of captivity unfolded, it became impossible to ignore the lesson that stared us in the face every morning at breakfast and every evening at dinner. The true power of America was not only in its weapons. It was in its capacity to produce without end, to feed armies and prisoners alike as if scarcity did not exist. Each slice of bread placed on our trays was more than food. It was evidence. Evidence that the United States had mastered something deeper than tactics or strategy. It had mastered the war of supply. The abundance we saw was not accidental. It was born of factories that never slept, of farms that harvested oceans of grain, of ships and trains that carried goods across continents with clockwork precision. Where we Germans measured victory in meters of ground gained, they measured it in millions of tons delivered. And it was those numbers, relentless and merciless, that crushed us. For us, endurance had been elevated to a virtue. To starve and keep marching was called strength. To go without meat or milk was called sacrifice. We told ourselves that suffering proved our superiority. Yet captivity exposed the lie. We discovered that strength was not to endure hunger, but to eliminate it. Discipline was not to ignore the body's needs, but to meet them with scientific precision. We realized that every American soldier entered battle not weakened by deprivation, but fortified by a system designed to keep him strong. The humiliation was complete. To admit that our enemy had outproduced us was painful enough. To admit that they had outcared for their men, and even for their enemies, was unbearable. But facts spoke louder than pride. We were healthier, stronger, more human in their captivity than in our own ranks. And that contradiction forced us to confront a truth darker than defeat. We had been serving a regime that could not even feed us, while the enemy we despised treated nourishment as a basic right, even for prisoners. By the time we were marched into permanent camps with hot showers, flush toilets, and kitchens that seemed like marvels of another world, the last illusions had collapsed. We knew then what none of us would say aloud, but all of us understood. Wars are not won by endurance alone. They are won by the power to sustain, to provide, to outproduce. The Americans had turned food itself into a weapon, and it was more decisive than any artillery barrage. As I look back, the image that endures is not of tanks clashing in the desert or planes dueling in the sky. It is of a tray set before me in captivity, soft white bread, steaming beef, and a cup of hot coffee. That tray was the quiet declaration of victory. It told us, without speeches or threats, that America possessed the strength to wage war not only with guns but with endless supplies. It told us that our sacrifice meant nothing against their abundance. And it left us with the bitter but undeniable conclusion: in the modern world, the arsenal that matters most is not forged only in steel and powder, but in the farms, factories, and kitchens that never stop producing. That was the final lesson of our captivity. The war had been lost long before our surrender. It had been lost in the mathematics of production, in the surpluses that America could generate and Germany could not. And we, who once believed ourselves the vanguard of a new order, learned the truth in the most ordinary, humbling way possible through the simple weight of food on a plate.